Hello and welcome to this talk on accessibility and mobile testing tools. My name is Helen Burge and I'm the Director of Digital Accessibility at Tesneo. So in this session, we aim to cover meeting me, your speaker, what accessibility is, the mobile tools for testing accessibility as a starting point, and the questions you might have at the end. So my credentials. I always believe when talking to any group, I should share why I'm qualified. So I'm qualified to talk on accessibility and mobile because I've started working accessibility since 2000. I was at university, it was my gap year, and I was doing ADA testing on some CRM content relationship management systems. But the main reason why I started testing accessibility was because of a friend that was blind. She couldn't get her keyboard to focus her music player, so she had to ask me to be the tool to start her music. And it was such a simple thing that stopped her from enjoying her own music and being able to be autonomous on her own, that made me realize that small changes can make a big difference to humans. Anyway, as part of my journey, I started doing other testing and doing accessibility at something as well as my main role of testing, functional tester, performance tester, automation, so on. But in 2010, I realized that my passion of accessibility could be a full-time job, and I managed to make it work. I also volunteered with the W3C as part of the Accessibility Conformance Test Rules community group. And from my work there, where we are trying to make the success criterion that I'll go through later, into automated rules that can be agreed upon by different automation tool vendors. The work I've been doing on the manual test rules side is seen as important. So I'm now an official invited expert to the W3C. And I've also, in my journey as an accessibility auditor, also tested mobile, whether it was native applications or web applications. I always felt that because it's a digital asset, the web content part of WCAG is not always truly the only way that you can use them. They do apply to mobile. So I've been doing that practically for years. So what is accessibility? I've talked a lot about it, but I think we should cover the definition of accessible. So on this slide, you might be able to see an image of what I describe as a narrow street with overhanging buildings. And there's some bikes parked at the back. And you can see someone on their moped about to drive down there. So can you walk down it? I believe it's possible to walk down. You might be a bit nervous of the narrowness, but it is possible to walk down. Can you take a bike down there? I think the answer is in the picture of the person about to drive down there. So yes, you can take a bike down there. And also the parked bikes have obviously traveled down there to get there. But would a car fit? Someone did say they thought a smart car might fit down here, but I think the smart car would become less smart and more of half a car. And you might get a bit of a sore head from the collision. So the car would not fit. And this visual representation is how it is for most people interacting with your digital assets. Being disabled is not the same as having an impairment. It is about the environment creating a barrier that you cannot use it. So each of the people are either walking, using a bike, or using the car. They have different tools that they're using to move themselves. However, the one choosing to use a car has a barrier that they can't undo. You can't move the buildings apart. So a car driver, through no fault of their own, is blocked from using the street. And this is the same for accessibility, where people are They have a physical disability and they use assistive technology to interact with digital assets. But because the digital asset is not accessible, the assistive technology will not work. So that means they are blocked from having the same experience. And there's many benefits to accessibility. So the biggest one from the World Health Organization have done some studies, and in 2016, 15% of the world's population were classed as disabled. 15% is about 1 billion people. You may not have a digital asset for everybody in the world, but when you think about 15% that you are excluding from using your digital asset, you're excluding part of your audience. And another thing is when people require assistive technology, when things work well or don't work, they will tell each other. So I have a Slack group that I'm a member of, an accessibility Slack group, and they have a rant and a wins channel where they will share their frustrations and rant and their successes and wins. And other people will read that and will be swayed away from the rant products from using them and into the wins products because they're doing something good and proactive for disabled users. So the larger audience is also not just those with a disability, but those that know people affected by disability. Because if, say, my mother was excluded from using a product because of her need for glasses, I also happen to need, I would choose not to use that product. Also, accessibility drives innovation and increases engagement. So the innovation, when you think about the car driver on that street on the slide before, they would have to think of an alternative to get to the other end of the street. And that is innovation. It's when you're challenged to think differently to find solutions for all the users. Because like I said before, you cannot move those buildings apart. You have to think about an alternative route. And also increase engagement. So if you think about captions, when you're watching a video on Facebook and you're in a public place, are you likely to have the volume up or the captions on? I tend to have the captions on. So that gives increased engagement because people are less likely to be put off from engaging with your content. And it's well known that there's many times on your mobile you do not want people outside of your inner circle to hear what you're doing. Like, for instance, sleeping children. You want them to stay sleeping. Or if you're watching something a bit more adult than your children, then you might put the captions on so that they don't hear anything you don't want them to. And there has been a few statistics bandied about, but 80% of people are more likely to watch a video all the way through if it has captions. So accessibility benefits everyone. It's not just about people that are permanently disabled. So when you look at this image on this slide, you've got the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, which shows permanent, temporary, and situational impairments. So permanent is something that will not change. So for instance, hearing, when you're deaf, you'll never hear. But you might have an ear infection, which means your hearing is not quite as good. But you should hopefully recover from that ear infection. Or a bartender who, in the situation of a noisy bar, cannot hear things. So in those cases, you might have an application where you can order drinks through your mobile app, which means the bartender doesn't have to hear an order, and they'll more likely get your order correct. And there's other situations too. I often think of myself when I first get up in the morning. My understanding of items is a little bit more cloudy because I need a bit of coffee. So before coffee, an accessible site, which is easy to see, easy to read, easy to follow, is less likely to be a burden to me. And I know that everyone has moments when accessibility will benefit you. And if you want to go and get the design toolkit, if you go to Microsoft.com design inclusive, you'll be able to access those designs. Anyway, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, a brief history. So created by the W3C, and we can see their logo there, W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. And the first guidelines were authored in 1995 after a keynote speech at a conference in 1994 highlighted the need for accessibility. However, this meant 38 versions of guidelines were published. Can you imagine trying to find one that you can follow when there's so much different opinions on what is accessible? So in 1998, 3 years later, they unified these versions into the Unified Website Accessibility Guidelines. And May 1999, literally 25 years ago, 5th of May 1999, the World Wide Web Consortium released WCAG 1. And it was a group consensus of web standards that people from different companies, different groups affected by accessibility. So you might have the COGA group, the cognitive operative, I forget what it stands for, but the COGA group is about the neurodiverse people. Then you've also got people that are representing blind users and so on. They came to a consensus of these checkpoints. And in the background, over the next 9 years, an independent group was updating them because 2 years after the publication of the first WCAG release, WCAG 2 was suggested, and it took almost 8 years before it was published in December 2008. Again, it's getting the consensus that can cause some of the confusion because they need to be repeatable and testable items, trying to remove subjectivity, which is very difficult in accessibility. So, International Organization for Standardization recognized them 4 years after they were published, and Europe recognized them 6 years after they were published. And then, because in 2008, their first iPhone hadn't been released with a screen reader yet. It was 2009 when that happened. WCAG 2 was desktop oriented. So 2.1, almost 10 years after the first WCAG 2 was published, we had 2.1 release. It was very exciting because it had mobile and neurodiverse checkpoints added in. So for the mobile, we had orientation and actuation where you're shaking your phone, because I keep being told you shouldn't shake your laptop, Helen. So that was quite exciting. Took 10 years though, and that's how much discussion was going into it. And in 2023, last year, 2.2 was published. So 5 years after the 2.1 update, we had another one that was more about neurodiverse conditions or neurodivergent, like accessible authentication, meaning that you can log in more than one way. That includes copy and paste. And WCAG 3 is in development. The good news about it is web content is going to be replaced by W3C. So it's going to be WCAG still, but it's going to be W3C accessibility guidelines because digital assets will cover things like documentation, authoring tools, all the different items that should be accessible because they're used by the public will come under the AG or the Silver Group as it's called. So WCAG in a nutshell. We're on 2.2 at the moment. It is a W3C recommendation. It has 3 levels. It's got A, AA, and AAA. A is the top of a pyramid, with AA followed by AAA. We target AA, which includes A and AA, because that is the legal standard for most countries. When I say we, I'm talking about accessibility as a whole and TESLIO as well. We target what is legally required for the A and AA. AAA is a nice to have, but is not going to um, be enforced fully because it's quite difficult and more subjective than the other ones. It's also got four principles. We've got perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable is, do I rely on one sense to understand the content? Do I have to see it to know what's going on? Do I have to hear it? And so on. Operable, if I can use the mouse, can I use the keyboard? Understandable, is the language clear? Are the form controls given meaningful errors and so on? And robust, that is it sticking to the guidance given for HTML5 and ARIA, the accessible rich internet applications coding standards that the W3C provide? That's basically, are you doing as a best practice the recommended items? And when it comes to backward compatibility, all WCAG 2 is built on with 2.1, then 2.2, which means that 2.2 is backward compatible with 2.1 and 2. And we have a WCAG quick reference by the W3C and also WCAG, the other way that some people pronounce it. I do WCAG. WCAG tends to be a simplified version of the checklist for developers in mind. So onto mobile tools for testing accessibility. So now you know a bit the surface of what accessibility is and what WCAG means. Now it comes to testing. Like I say, although they're written with desktop in mind, you can apply it to native applications and to web apps on the mobile because they are interchangeable. So we have the first thing, screen readers. It's a program that will read visible content for those that might not read it easily, including blind, visually impaired, or those that find reading difficult. So we have an image here of VoiceOver is turned on. We can see that VoiceOver on is what's been announced by the screen reader, and it's focusing on a button accessibility. So ideally, what it includes is the semantics. So if I'm on accessibility button, I will hear accessibility, comma, button. I don't want that button in a label. What I want is the role button so that when I interact with it, it does what a button should do. As in with the screen reader on, double tap, it moves back. It just includes information that's not rendered and can be a developer's best friend or worst nightmare because it will quickly show when a developer has followed the best practices for the robust rule or when they have maybe neglected it, and then items might not be focusable, they might not work because they've not been following the best practices. And when it comes to screen readers to use, you've got iOS VoiceOver and Android TalkBack. Those are the most commonly used in the market. And keyboard. Keyboard is one that's often overlooked, and that is because when it comes to interacting on a mobile, you often think of your hands, your gestures, and with a screen reader, you have slightly different gestures, which means people assume that keyboard will be covered, but that's not really the case. And it's not often covered by testing. And I used to, in my younger days, not cover keyboard, but Bluetooth keyboard is different from the keyboard on your desktop because that will be a tab interface where you interact via the tab key and then enter and space depending. However, Bluetooth keyboard, you can tab through and or use the arrow keys. So you need to make sure that you're using the content appropriately. And it's also an easier starting point for switch testing. A switch device is used by someone who may not be able to use the hand gestures that well and will have, it often looks like two buttons, but it's edges of buttons, side of buttons. And I recommend with switch testing to leave it until you know a bit more about the Bluetooth testing. So start off with Bluetooth testing with the keyboard. And when you come to switch testing, use a Bluetooth keyboard because using facial gestures without an actual switch device for switch testing, I almost had to do a factory reset on my phone because I had to look one way to select things and another way to activate them. Um, it was painful. So I recommend if you're going to do any switch testing, read up on how it works and make sure you've got a Bluetooth keyboard to map all the gestures to. And then we've got color contrast. I have the TPGI tool here of the color contrast analyzer. Now, I recommend either use a screenshot on your phone or the automation tools. The automation tools can catch most of them, but some of them are like sometimes there's a slight discoloration of the valid hex code on the actual screen. So what we see is not what's programmed in. So a screenshot's the best way to validate them at the end, but use an automation tool for a starting point. For mobile, there is three checks that you should be thinking about. Normally there is 3-to-1 for large text or items on there. It's better to go for the regular text 4.5-to-1 for mobile because you have a smaller screen. Large text and barely visible outlines are going to be very difficult. And that's why it's also recommended in the mobile groups to use the enhanced AAA requirement of 7-to-1. Because if I'm out with my mobile and it's a sunny day, a stronger contrast, like here we've got black and white, which is 21-to-1, a stronger contrast is easier to read. Things close to 4.5 or less will be difficult to read in sunny conditions. And then we've got zoom. So one of the checkpoints for WCAG 2.2 is about zoom, being able to zoom the application. And it's often overlooked by mobile developers as something that should be possible because others don't do it. Doesn't make it right because unfortunately the checkpoint does say you should be able to zoom in without the need for assistive technology. And mobile applications do come under the user agent accessibility guidelines where you should allow the person to zoom. So there are two different sets of guidelines telling you zoom should be allowed. And this could be done by using pinch screen. There are ways to force a zoom on some operating systems, but those are kind of overriding and are not the best practices. And also you can end up with lots of variations of items to code for. So I tend to stick to pinch screen for the zoom you might have in a browser and changing the font size in the operating system level. Changing the font size is probably the better one to do than the pinch zoom because that's very much like the magnifier but then again it's easier to fit it in because you scroll around. Anyway, try to make sure zooming works. Then we have automation. On iOS, we've got Xcode, Accessibility Inspector, which you launch by having your iPhone paired to your Mac. And you can run through the application as it's running on your phone, and you find the results where it will let you know the code failures. Same for the Google Accessibility Scanner for Android. It will download onto your phone, so you don't need to pair it with the device, and it will let you know when you're not meeting the accessibility guidelines. So one of the important ones that I always say is best done with automation is touch target size, and Kobiton adds an option for testing touch target size. This was something proposed as a level A for 2.1. However, the 44 by 44 CS pixels was very hard to achieve and they couldn't get to an agreement. It was agreed at the end to push it down to a AAA because of the difficulty in trying to have large buttons on, say, a mobile device. Or what if you've got a paragraph of text with 3 links in it? You'll end up lots of situations where it doesn't work. However, in 2.2, they reduced it to 24 by 24 CSS pixels, and it's a level AA. And it's the touch size of the button and the area around it. There are exceptions, like if it's inline or if there's an equivalent, a different button elsewhere that has the right size. But overall, try to stick to 44 by 44 if you can. And also because it's not easy to see the touch area, you can't see where the items around it are. It's hard to test manually, and I recommend using a tool to help. And Kobiton also has an accessibility application programming and interface check, which is like with the automation tools, where it highlights what's at fault and it helps um, you setting up what items you want to set in. So it will check that you're meeting the success criterion. It will optimize and let you change items for text to speech and braille so that it can be more accessible. And also, you also have a way to make your labels more precise. So to summarize, accessibility is for everyone. This talk is just a starting point. I didn't go through as much as I could have, and I kept having to bite my tongue to stop going into too much detail. There's so much on this subject. The guidelines will apply to mobile even if they're not explicitly called out, because some of it's just common sense. Like if it's an image, I should have a text alternative to it. Testing with mobile devices should be manual and automation. I don't think either or will work fully. They go really well together. And lastly, happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day. GAD, it is today, and thank you for attending this session. Any questions?
All right. Thank you for that, Helen, and thank you for joining us for some questions here at the end. You mentioned it at the end of your session that today is actually Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And I was hoping you could expand a little bit on that, what the day is, and how people can help spread awareness.
Sure. It was the 13th, or today's the 13th year of Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and it was a day brought about to champion accessibility as a starting point to get people thinking and incorporating accessibility to their work. So attending talks on this day is greatly encouraged, and everyone who's watched this video has helped celebrate in their own way.
Excellent. Yeah, I know. It seems like in the last year, and rightfully so, accessibility has kind of had its moment, especially in the tech world. So for those of us on the audience watching this live, um, what do you have suggestions for them as far as getting started, or is there something you would recommend if they're looking to make their apps more accessible on specifically on mobile devices?
I think the starting point is making sure that you don't try to reinvent the wheel. Most of the times when things are inaccessible, it's when someone's tried to build a custom item when the default has accessibility baked in. Um, and also colors. Colors are the biggest downfall for most people when they have weak color contrast, which means it's hard for anyone to read. And on a mobile screen, when you think about the fact the mobile moves so much and you catch sunlight on it, you need stronger text to be able to read it properly in sunlight or different varying. Basically, the mobile is never in a fixed position, and we're not often talking with it to our ears, but talking with it in front of us and so on. So making sure that you don't overcomplicate, keep things clean and simple, and if in doubt, use an automation tool to help check it, and maybe look into the W3C about any resources that are available to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I know you touched on a few of those during your session as well. And I think it's one of those things like we all use mobile devices. They're so ingrained into daily life now, and making sure that any user has the ability to pick it up and leverage the applications that folks here are building themselves is crucial. I know we're coming up on time here, but is there any parting words you have for the audience before we head off to the next session?
No, thank you for coming, and I hope it was enlightening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Helen. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Cheers.